All right, in chapter 19, we are actually starting to move into plants to finish out our semester. All right, so just first of all, changing and adapting to terrestrial living. So plants, of course, complex multicellular organisms, and they are autotrophs, and auto meaning self, troph meaning feeding, so self-feeding. They're able to do that because they perform photosynthesis, and they occur almost exclusively on land. And kind of the dominant organisms on the surface of the earth, over 300,000 different species of plants we have today. So just their ability to live on land. So green algae are thought to be ancestors of those plants that, of course, were aquatic. Of course, those are not very adapted to living on land. So what were some of the things they had to be able to overcome? So they needed to be able to absorb minerals on land rather than water, conserve water for times when water wasn't available, and also, of course, reproduce using land rather than water. So the ability to absorb minerals, they require about 6 inorganic minerals. Those include nitrogen, potassium, calcium, phosphorus, magnesium, and sulfur. And these minerals make up about 1% or more of the plant's dry weight. So very important to them and their ability to survive. And again, they can't make them, so they have to take them in, which means they need to be able to absorb them with water using their roots. So the first plants are thought to have had a symbiotic relationship, meaning a relationship with another organism in which both benefit. And that relationship was thought to be with a fungus called mycorrhizae that helped them absorb that. Now, their ability to conserve water. So again, one of the key challenges is not living in water. You need to be able to conserve it when it's not available. So there was an outer covering called a cuticle that has a waxy substance. So the water that was inside didn't penetrate through that waxy layer because water doesn't mix with wax. So then the water enters the plants through the roots, and then the cuticle prevents it from being lost into the air. Now, of course, there needs to be some gas exchange through that waxy layer that can occur, so they can't get carbon dioxide in to make glucose or release oxygen through that waxy layer either. So they have specialized pores called stomata or stoma singularly that are on there that allow water and gases to go through the cuticle as well. So these are on the leaves, sometimes a little bit on the stem, but again, it allows passage of gases like carbon dioxide for photosynthesis, but then also water vapor and oxygen to escape. This is just showing a picture of them. So the stoma, again, just a small opening. Now they can't open and close them, so there are these guard cells that are on the side, so they can fill to close that gap, or they can relax and open, so kind of like a muscle almost. But those guard cells allow the opening and closing of the stoma. Now, reproducing on land had some unique challenges because, again, of course, on land they couldn't move. They didn't have legs or another ability to move. So it was necessary for them to pass their gametes, so those egg or sperm or their haploid cells, from one individual to another without using water. So the first plants are thought to have had like a film of water for their sperm to swim in, swim to an egg, and then fertilize it. So then later, pollen evolved, and then pollen, of course, allows the transferring of gametes without them drying out, and that can be dispersed in water, like rain, or in by the wind, or of course by other animals like birds or bees. So alternation of generations. So in those earlier plants, meiosis was delayed, and the cells of the zygote, again, the zygote is the fertilized egg cell whenever they come together during fertilization, divided to produce multicellular diploid structures. So that resulted in what's called alternation of generations, where the diploid generation alternates with a haploid one. So it essentially changes from a diploid generation called the sporophyte to a haploid generation called a gametophyte. So instead of that all being kind of like one permanent reproductive, again, they alternate between diploid and haploid. So again, diploid is called the sporophyte. Haploid, which only has one of each chromosome, is gametophyte. So if we remember gametes are haploid, that helps us remember that term. So again, kind of the generalized life cycle for a plant. So here in this gametophyte, again, that's the haploid. So then that gametophyte, we have our egg and our sperm that come together during that fusion. That produces a diploid, 2 of each chromosome, zygote. That zygote develops into an embryo, and now we're into the diploid generation. So now it's referred to as a sporophyte. Then that sporophyte then develops into sporangia. They produce spore mother cells. So kind of like the oocytes, little similar, or in the sperm, but this is called a spore mother cell. Again, it's diploid, but these are cells that will be used for fertilization. Those mother cells are going to divide by meiosis. That produces 4 haploid cells called spores. Then that spore develops into that gametophyte generation. Again, then the gametophyte can produce the egg and sperm cells using mitosis. All right, so then some of the other evolution, there were 4 key advances that occurred. So that alternation of generations. So again, the sporophyte became the dominant generation in all but the earliest plants. Then the vascular tissue to transport the water and the nutrients, and also to provide some structural support needed to occur. Seeds provided the nutrients and protections for those embryos until it had favorable conditions. And then later flowers and fruits to improve successful mating and sedimentary, again, not being able to move, and the dispersal of those seeds. So if we look at kind of the phylogenetic tree that's been proposed, so we have non-vascular plants, then seedless, but then vascular, so developing that vascular tissue, but not able to quite produce seeds yet. Then we get the gymnosperms that are able to produce the seeds, as we see here on the pine cone. And then later, the angiosperms that develop the fruit and the flowers. So starting first with the non-vascular plants. So the first successful plants, again, didn't have that vascular tissue. So in order to maximize the size, they were limited because, again, the minerals and the materials had to move by osmosis and diffusion. So there wasn't like a circulatory system for them to use. So they couldn't get very big. So only 2 phyla of living plants today completely lack a vascular system, and those are liverworts and hornworts. So both the liverworts and hornworts do not have a vascular system. So those are the 2 remaining. Now a third phylum of plants has a very simple conductive tissue, and those are our mosses. So again, it's not quite as advanced as most vascular systems, but there is a little bit of conduction occurring. So again, liverworts and hornworts, completely no vascular system. Mosses, kind of a very simple idea of transport. So then that evolution of the vascular tissue. So 7 phyla have the vascular system and are called vascular plants. So they have, kind of like arteries and veins, so cylindrical, elongated cells going through the plant. There are 2 different types of vascular tissue, so xylem and phloem, and essentially it's the direction that they move. So xylem conducts water and minerals from the roots up to the rest of the plant. Then phloem takes carbs like the glucose that was made throughout the plant. So it's more about direction. So xylem is going up, phloem is kind of coming down to the roots or throughout the plant. So a couple concepts here. So primary and secondary growth. So again, these earliest plants here are divided by cell division from the stems and the roots. So primary growth is what makes that up. So growing essentially longer or taller is the stems and the roots expanded or lengthened. That's referred to as primary growth, so the height. Then later the vascular plants developed kind of a new way of adding rings of cells, that could divide on the periphery, so getting them wider, and that's referred to as secondary growth. So that allowed them to increase in diameter from the stem. So the product of secondary growth there is wood. So we think about like the annual ring. So as the tree continues to get wider and wider, that is secondary growth. How tall the tree gets is the primary. All right, now moving into our seeds. So two phyla have seedless vascular plants. So they do have a vascular system. They advance from the liver and the hornworts in the mosses, but they still were not able to produce seeds. So ferns and lub mosses are the two phyla that still exist that do not have seeds, but do have a vascular system. So what happens is in the ferns, that sporophyte, again, that's the diploid cell. So in that generation, it's much larger and more complex than the gametophyte. So again, it's alternating between those. So the leaves are called fronds. So those leaves on the sporophyte are called fronds, and they have those diploid cells. And this also includes whisk ferns and horsetails. All right, so just kind of looking at some of these. So again, we have these seedless vascular plants, but on those leaves are the fronds, and the fronds have that sporophyte generation. All right, now if we move into the seeds, and those that are able to not only have a vascular tissue, but also produce seeds, of course, the seed's crucial for adaptation because it protects the embryonic plant. So again, it helps provide that protection during that vulnerable stage. So thinking about like a baby, whatever protection it has, that seed provides. So it produces two kinds of gametophytes. So it makes the male and the female. And then those develop completely within that sporophyte. So within the sporophyte, the diploid generation, then they can divide to make both male and female gametes. The male gametophyte, again, haploid, those are called pollen grains. They arise from what are called microspores. And then females contain the egg in what's called the ovule. So that kind of helps us a little bit. We think about an ovary having the egg in females. So in the plants, the ovule contains the gamete of the egg. And those are made from megaspores. So again, the sporophyte produces both male and females. The males are called pollen grains made by microspores. And then the eggs are made by the ovule by megaspores. So then pollination, free water is not required though for that fertilization process, again, evolving or moving away from the need for water. So pollination by insects, winds, or other agents that essentially transfer the pollen, the male to the female, to the ovule. So then the pollen grain cracks open and it sprouts as what's called a pollen tube, and that brings the sperm directly to the egg inside the ovule. All right, now all of the seed plants come from a common ancestor. So we have gymnosperms. These are seeded plants. So again, the ovule is not completely enclosed by the sporophyte at the time of pollination. So it's slightly opened. Whereas in the angiosperms, in these seeded plants, they most recently evolved. The ovule is completely enclosed inside of a tissue called the carpel, and that's at the time of pollination. So gymnosperms, again, the egg is slightly opened up. It's not completely enclosed, whereas the angiosperms, that ovule and the eggs are completely enclosed. So just kind of looking here at an example of our seeded plant, you can see the little seeds here that are growing. So these seeds have three visible parts, a sporophyte embryo, then they have an endosperm, that's the food for the developing embryo, we think kind of like an egg. So we have the sporophyte embryo that's actually growing. We have the endosperm that provides the food, In some seeds, the endosperm is actually used up by the embryo and stored food in the structure is called cotyledons. We'll come back to those. We'll talk about mono and dicotyledons. So then also a drought-resistant protective covering. So they have an embryo, an endosperm for food, and then sometimes some type of protective covering. Now the benefits of seeds is that it improves their ability to adapt. So the dispersal, again, migration and dispersal to new habitats, the seeds can be transferred by wind, by other organisms, lots of different modes to get them into different places. Again, because they're resistant, they can be dormant, so they can postpone that development until they have favorable conditions and more likely to survive. Germination, this controls when the plant develops, so that it can be synchronized with certain aspects of the habitat like temperature, maybe pH, rainy seasons, that type of thing. So again, it can kind of control that development. And then it also provides nourishment. So the provision of the young plant still has food during that initial germination. So seeds, again, allow plants to kind of bypass that dry season. So it allows them to store up those nutrients, remain resistant until favorable conditions reoccur. All right, now our gymnosperms, there are 4 phyla that make up the gymnosperms. So again, these are the ones that have the egg not completely enclosed inside of that ovule. So there are conifers. These are trees. Again, the seeds are in cones, and most have kind of needle-like leaves. The cycads, these have short stems and palm-like leaves. The netophytes, there are only 3 kinds of this really weird kind of plant. And then also ginkgo. So ginkgo biloba has some, you may have heard of it. It has been shown to maybe have some benefit with memory. But this ginkgo plant, there's only 1 living species. And again, it's made by this maidenhair tree and has these fan-shaped leaves. All right, just looking at a few examples. Again, here's our conifers that we see, those pine cones that get made, the ginkgo that's down here. So again, these produce seeds, but in the gymnosperms, it's not that egg is not completely enclosed by the ovule. Now the life cycle of the conifers, so this is kind of the typical gymnosperm, so we'll just kind of focus on it. So there are 2 types of cones. So there are seed cones and there are pollen cones. So kind of back to our pollen grain and our ovule that we'd seen before. So here in the cones, there are essentially male and female. So seed cones have the female gametophyte, and then the pollen cones have the pollen grains that have the male gametophytes. So those pollen grains get dispersed by the wind to the seed cones. Then the fertilized seed cones actually make the seeds, and then those seeds can be wind dispersed. And then germination will grow into that new sporophyte, which is diploid plant. But again, it can remain dormant for a while and kind of control when it develops. All right, so then the rise of our angiosperms, they're actually 90% of all the living plants are angiosperms, so the majority fall into this last category. So virtually all of our food that we used is derived either directly or indirectly from angiosperms. But the key thing about these is they use flowers to induce insects and other animals to carry their pollen for them. So pollination is assured by direct delivery to the egg. So our flowers is a little basic structure. They have 4 what are called concentric circles or whorls. That's connected to the base of the flower called the receptacle. There are sepals that form on the outermost of those circles or those whorls, and they typically protect is their job, so they're protection from physical damage. Then the petals are on the second whorl, again, that concentric circle, and those attract the pollinators. And then on the third whorl, the male parts called the stamen contain kind of a swollen anther that makes the pollen. Again, the pollen is the male gametophyte. All right, so they have the base being the receptacles. They have these whorls. The sepals are the outermost part of that protect it from physical damage. The petals help attract pollinators. And then the stamen has the pollen and is the male part. Now the innermost whorl, so the last one, is called the carpel, and it has the female part. So that's where those ovules occur, and they actually bulge into an area called the ovary, so just like in females. Then the stalk that comes out is called a style. It rises from that ovary and ends with a sticky tip called the stigma. And that stigma, because again it's sticky, receives that male gametophyte on the pollen, right? So again, we have the flowers to attract them. Then we have our stamen that make the pollen, and then we have the carpels here with our ovary and the female part. All right, so just kind of looking at our picture here. So again, the receptacle here at the base, our sepal here offers some protection for the plant. Then our petals to attract those pollinators. And then we have our male and female. So again, the male is the stamen that's here, kind of has this long tube with our anther at the end. That's where, again, our male pollen is going to be. And then the female portion here, we have this stigma, the little style coming down, and then the ovary at the bulging at the bottom, where those eggs are going to be, again, completely enclosed to make up the angiosperms. So why are there different kinds of flowers? It's mainly because insects and plants have co-evolved, so meaning they have changed over time at the same kind of time that these flowering plants have changed. So there are certain insects that kind of specialize in visiting particular kinds of flowers. So as a result, particular insects carry pollen from maybe just one individual flower to another of the same species. Because again, we can't have like a tulip fertilizing with a cherry tree. Okay, so by having different insects that help carry those, that insect's attracted to the same type of plant. So it allows that fertilization, the delivery of the pollen to the same plant, not to 50 different other kinds of plants. Of course, bees are the most numerous of those insect pollinators. So birds also, though, pollinate some flowers, especially the red ones. And then grasses and some other angiosperms use wind for pollination. So again, just how the bee kind of sees the flower, kind of interesting. Of course, this is what we see here in A, but they actually see something slightly different based on the cells in their eyes. So this is what it would look like there in B. So again, they're attracted to this region here where the pollen is, so they can attract that, of course, and then carry it to another similar type of plant to deliver it. Again, our birds can also be used. Typically, though, red flowers are what they're attracted to, especially our little hummingbird that's specially adapted, where its beak goes in down to get the pollen at the end there of that stamen. We also have a process called double fertilization. So angiosperms make highly nutritious tissue called endosperm inside the seed. Again, that's the food for them. So when a flower is pollinated, that pollen tube grows down from that pollen grain, again, the haploid male gametophyte that's on that stigma. Then the pollen grain has two haploid sperm. So the first sperm fuses with the egg at the base of that ovary. So again, typical fertilization. Now the second sperm that's there fuses with a polar nuclei to form what's called a triploid endosperm cell. And that divides faster than the zygote and actually produces that endosperm tissue. So that provides the food. So remember, whenever eggs divide, they don't divide evenly, and we have a bigger one that actually becomes the egg, and then a smaller one called the polar body. Well, what happens here, again, there are two sperm. So the first one fertilizes the egg. The second one fuses with that polar body that's there, and that ultimately forms the endosperm. So the process of fertilization, though, produces both a zygote and the endosperm, so double fertilization. Two sperm are fertilizing both the egg and the polar body. The egg, of course, develops into the zygote in the plant. The endosperm helps provide the food for it. All right, so I said we would come back to monocots and dicots, talking about that cotyledon. So again, in some angiosperms, that endosperm is fully used up by the time the seed matures. So those food reservoirs are stored there in the embryo in a swollen kind of fleshy part called the cotyledon or seed leaves. So we have two different types of these cotyledons. Again, they're completely using up that endosperm. So we have dicots because they have two cotyledon regions, or mono because they have one. Now, if we look at some of the differences, so again, our two cotyledons, so here on both sides, we have that endosperm, whereas in the monocots, just one endosperm, one cotyledon. A way to tell them apart is on the leaves. So the veins of the leaves on the dicots are nice and branched. They kind of go all over the place. Whereas on the monocots, like a corn plant, those leaf veins are all in parallel and in straight lines. And then another way to tell them apart is the flowers. So whenever the flower is full, dicots have multiples of 4 or 5 petals, whereas monocots have multiples of 3. All right, so then kind of ending up here talking about our fruits. So a mature ovary that surrounds that ovule, again in our angiosperm, becomes all or part of that fruit. So the angiosperms use that fruit to induce animals, again, kind of like the petals of our flowers. They can also use the fruit to come and disperse those seeds. So although eaten by the animals, the seeds, because they're dormant within the fruit, they're resistant to that chewing and digestion. So they pass out in the feces, and then they're ready to germinate at new locations that can even be far away from where the plant started. And of course, some of them can be dispersed by wind and water as well. So just some of the different ways. Again, so our berries here can be digested. So again, those seeds are not broken down, so they pass through the feces, and now they're in a new location. Or those seeds can use water, think about the ocean, or even rain, or hurricanes, or by wind.